So what I'll transition to here is now talking about the psychology of depression, because you better have that piece in the story or else you're absolutely useless. Starting off with, I make apologies here, but I actually have to say the name of Sigmund Freud here, because he winds up being very relevant to depression. Freud, back when, dealt with this puzzle of the difference between we all get depressed and come out the other end and the subset of people who crash. The turn of the century Viennese term for people who come out the other side, mourning. You mourn something and you recover. Turn of the century Viennese term for major depression, melancholia. And Freud in this famous essay said, why is it that a subset of us fall into it and don't count? What's the difference between mourning and melancholia? And he came up with a really interesting model. Okay, according to Freud, you have mixed feelings, ambivalencies about everybody you love out there. You love them and you hate them and you resent them and you yearn for them and you reject them and all that Freudian stuff. So in this Freudian view, you have lost a loved one. That can also be a loved concept, a loved goal, a loved... You have lost a loved one. What happens then is, in most people, you are able to focus on the love and the sense of loss. You mourn, and you come out the other end. In Freud's view, what melancholia is about is the subset of people who can't put the negative feelings in the background, and instead you are awash in the love and the hate and the regret and the pain and the delight and all of that. And what a depression is this wallowing, this melancholic loss in the ambivalencies you have about the lost loved one. It explains tons. No wonder you have the grief. Lose somebody and go through the mourning business and only one thing is wrong, you've lost this loved one. Lose somebody with melancholia and two things have happened. You've lost the loved one and you have now lost the opportunity to ever make things better with them. No wonder you have the guilt. You're sitting there saying, thank God I'm finally done with this person. They are never going to control my life. How can I think such a thing like that? Sudden crippling guilt, all sorts of other symptoms. And out of this came this wonderful soundbite. Depression is aggression turned inward, because you got nobody else out there to have these arguments with. This is the person who you have most loved but most hated, and you've never said the things you've needed to hear, and pounding at the door to get them to finally be able to tell them, and now you've lost that opportunity forever, and all you can do is internalize all of that aggression turned inward. No wonder you're not feeling a whole lot of pleasure. No wonder you're secreting stress hormones. No wonder you're not getting out of bed all that readily with the psychomotor retardation stuff. This really powerful soundbite of aggression turned inward. That's great. What isn't great is how in hell do you turn like Freudian ambivalent feelings into something about neurochemistry, or like what do estrogen progesterone ratios have to do with like love-hate ratios? It's great, it feels very intuitive, you can't do modern science on it, which is the problem with the best parts of Freud. Okay, so instead you need to shift over to looking at experimental psychology and understanding what is the psychology of stress. What is it that makes psychological stressors stressful? And an enormous literature now shows that for the same external misery, you feel more stressed, you turn on a stress response, you are more at risk for stress-related disease if you don't have outlets for the frustration caused by the stressor, if you feel like you have no control over what's happening, you have no predictability as to when it's occurring, and you don't have anybody's shoulder to cry on. This is what psychological stress is about. And what a depression is pathological extremes of this. You fall into the cognitive psychology soundbite of what a depression is. It's learned helplessness. It is learning to be helpless. Something bad happens to you, a rat, getting some shocks now and then, you, a human experiencing some loss, and the logical thing you should do is learn, this is awful. When I'm in this situation, there's not a damn thing I can do about it. It's awful, I feel terrible, but this is not the whole world. And what a major depression is about is you sit there and you are that rat, and in this setting, you get uncontrollable shocks, but put you in another setting, and just by hitting a lever a couple of times, you avoid the shocks. You don't bother doing it because you've learned to be helpless. just like a human depression. What learned helplessness is taking a circumstance where by any logic, again, you should be saying, this is awful, but is not the whole world, and do this cognitive distortion and decide this is indeed the entire world. And I have no control. I am always helpless. I am always hopeless. This is the psychology of what a depression is about. At that point, you don't have a whole lot of trouble seeing how you wind up in here, stress, effects on some of the dopamine, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we've got two extremely different viewpoints here as to what depression is about. Modern biological stuff, and this totally different world of psychology, loss, lack of control. One version of it, one of the most reliable findings in the whole epidemiology of depression is lose a parent to death when you were under 10 years of age, and for the rest of your life you were more at risk for major depression. This makes perfect sense. What is a lot of what's going on during your first 10 years of life? You were learning about cause and effect. You were learning about, you're learning, is this a world out there where I have any sort of efficacy, where I have any sort of control? And you have just learned in the most big time awful way, there are things you can't control and sometimes they are awful. And what have you just learned? There's all sorts of reasons where one can be helpless. And you're that much closer to this edge of this learned helplessness cliff for the rest of your life. Extremely powerful model here of that. So you got all the biology stuff. You've got this weird Freudian aggression turned inward, which just feels right, but you can't do modern science on it. You got this whole world. How do you begin to put this world and that world together? And the critical link turns out to be stress. Stress is the intersection of the two in a very interesting domain. Okay, depression is a genetic disorder. What do I mean by that? Depression has some degree of heritability. Depression tends to run in families. Depression runs more reliably as you look at closer and closer relatives, and you eventually look at identical twins, and if one of them has depression, the other has a 50% chance. Full siblings who are not identical twins, 25% chance, half sibling, about 8%, person off the street, about a 2%, 50% chance when they share the identical genes. What does that do? That tells you this is a disorder that has a genetic component. What does that also tell you? If you've got 50% likelihood, if you've got all the genes in common, and you've got a 50% chance of not getting the depression, it tells you genes are important, but they're not more important than any other component. So genes in depression are not about inevitability, they're about vulnerability. So what is the vulnerability about? A few years ago, people discovered a particular gene that's really relevant to whether or not you get depression. What was exciting about that? It was a very clear finding. It has since been replicated. What else was exciting about it? It made sense. This was not some weirdo gene having something to do with how your big toe functions. This was a gene having something to do with serotonin. And this was a gene relevant to this whole reuptake, pumping business, all of that. The main point of it is this gene comes in two different flavors. Each one of us has one of the two versions. And you immediately get this prediction, one of the versions, by all logic, should be predisposing to depression. One of them is the one that should get you in more trouble here. So what does it look like when you go and study it? First paper that reported this a few years ago, and this I suspect is going to wind up being viewed as the most important paper in biological psychiatry for a quarter of a century. This was this massive study where a bunch of researchers looked at 17,000 kids growing up in New Zealand, following them year after year and looking at the genetic makeup of these individuals, and then asking in their early 20s, who's got problems with major depression? And then asking this critical question, what does it have to do with this gene? Does the version of that gene that gets you into trouble, by all logic, is that going to set you up for more of a depression? Are you more at risk for depression if you've got the bad version of the gene? And back comes the finding, which is no, it doesn't increase your risk. You look here, and what's your likelihood of depression? And you got the good version, and it's this likely, and you got the bad version, and it's this likely. Doesn't make a difference. Unless something else is going on, unless you have a history of exposure to major stressors. And what you were able to do is quantify how many major stressors somebody has had during their childhood, their development, and that involves parental divorce and physical abuse and death of family member, all that sort of thing. And what you see is in the folks who have the good version of the gene, as you have more and more of a history of major stressors, your risk of depression goes up, absolutely. Now you look at the people with the bad version of the gene, and as you have more and more of a history of stress, your risk of depression does this. And when you look at the major history of stressors, a 30-fold difference in the likelihood. This is not about, ooh, genes control our brains and genes control our behavior. This is a gene that is relevant to how readily we pick ourselves up after life has dumped us on our rear ends, how readily we recover from stressors. What's the final piece of that story? Glucocorticoids regulate the function of this gene. All the pieces fall into place there. Wonderfully logical, and suddenly you have a way of taking this whole world of psychological components of stress and tying it into all that biochemistry, wonderfully integrated model. Okay, so in lots of ways, this is where the field is at this point. And what should mostly have come through here amid all this minutia and factoids and all of that is the role of stress and the intersection of the biology and the psychological stuff and childhood as a very important time to imprint how vulnerable you are to depression for the rest of your life. But again, the single thing I want to emphasize over and over, implicit in everything on that left side of the board there, which is this is not, oh, pull yourself together, we all get depressed. This is as real of a biological disorder as is diabetes. And that's the thing I most want you guys to take off from here. And in the context of a university setting is rife with major depression, a community of high-achieving type A individuals is rife with major depression. It is all around us, and amid it being all around us, there is this weird corrosive inhibition, embarrassment, discomfort we have with the world of psychiatric diseases. One of the greatest things, if you're a researcher with disease, one of the things you pray for is for some powerful senator to have their loved one come down with your disease, because they're going to set up a foundation and get special funding, and there's advocacy groups and all of that, not for a psychiatric disorder. That's the one where people don't talk about it. And amid this screaming biology, and this is a devastating disease and all of that, in any place, and especially in a community like this, where everyone is supposed to be golden and functioning and flawless and just gliding through life, this is one of the hardest diseases for people to admit to. So it is there, it's all over the place, and it's biology. And you should be no more inhibited about admitting that you got something going on that's funny with this type of gene than you would be to admit that your pancreas isn't secreting insulin. So let me stop at this point. And again, unfortunately, I got to sprint out the door. Otherwise, I would take questions. But thanks.
Thank you for watching my videos. I hope these videos are helping people who are experiencing some mental ailments like anxiety, depression, or agoraphobia. Please keep in mind, you are not alone and things will get better. Until next time, stay begruntled.